Everybody. Right, I think we're away. Good evening, everybody. I first met Jules Pretty when we were doing our paper through the All-Party Parliamentary Group on the positive vision for London's Green Belt. And we desperately needed some information about the health and welfare aspects of the countryside, which of course is Jules's particular expertise. He gave a presentation to the MPs at the House of Commons, and he didn't hold back, and I'm not expecting him to do so this evening, and made one or two of them sit up, which was extremely good. In the preface from his book, Professor Pretty co-authored Green Exercise, Linking Nature, Health and Well-Being. It states, in affluent countries, people have become more stressed, are more likely to experience mental ill health, are at higher risk of developing non-communicable diseases, and are less active and more sedentary. Green exercise offers one way of addressing these energy health problems successfully, quickly, and cost-effectively. He's an excellent speaker, and I know we're going to enjoy what he's saying tonight. And now I'll pass over to Professor Jules Pretty. Jules.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you everybody for joining us. It's a shame we have to have those screens off because I quite like to look at people rather than blank dots, but there you go. Can I just check that I've shared the screen? Everyone can see the screen?
Yes, we can. That's fine.
Marvelous. Okay. So you've got the headlines there. I'm going to be making this link between nature, health, and low carbon good life. You'll have come across this term in the past. I'm going to come back to that later on. There's a core headline to the talk. It is that activities and being in nature tend to be low carbon, so they're good for climate crisis. They tend to be high in happiness, and they save the country money by improving health. So I'm just going to present some kind of headlines around those sorts of areas to tie together some kind of slightly different kinds of debates here. There will be time for questions at the end. As Richard said, I've got to be off at 7:30, I'm afraid, so slightly earlier than we thought, but I think there'll still be time. So let me just lead you through the kinds of things you'll be pretty familiar with, and that is this stuff around the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis in the past generation, and it's been really fast. We're into the 6th great species extinction, and we are very fast into the climate crisis. I've stopped calling it climate change. It is change, but it is more a crisis. This is the Riggs Glacier in Alaska, as it was one generation ago in the mid-1990s, same time of year as it is today. And actually you can find these sorts of before and after images all over the web. And they are kind of iconic because they tell us the sorts of changes that have been creeping up upon us and are now manifest in quite extremes of climate this year, and indeed this week, as we've seen in Los Angeles, in New Orleans, and then in New York. The climate crisis. So let me just put that point about 1990. 1990 was the year when the atmosphere passed 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide. That was a safe place for humanity. So in just one period of 30 years, a generation and a bit, but let's call it a generation, we've gone from a safe place to about 417 parts per million. And if we cast forward another 30 years, if we carry on at the same pace, all the wheels come off the world economy. And I'll just give you one example in a moment about that. It's that fast pace of how things have gone wrong, but it also then suggests, well, can we be as fast to link together the big concerns that we have around health, around green space, around activities and around the climate to actually make a kind of positive change? That's the kind of thesis and the hope. Well, you will have gathered, you may well have seen just recently, the IPCC issued its kind of early analysis of the 6th report, which is coming out next year. I'm an IPCC reviewer, so I knew what was coming, but what none of us had seen were these extremes that have been occurring this year. The hottest ever temperature recorded in Northern Ireland, the windiest storms, the hottest temperatures in the northwest of the US, in Siberia, nearly 40 degrees, and in Death Valley, the hottest ever temperature ever recorded in the world at 56 degrees. So that's all happened this summer. And the IPCC has concluded that we have already increased temperature by plus 1.2 degrees since the pre-industrial level. And until a year ago, we had hoped it was still only 1 degree, and we would be able to limit it to 1.5 or 2 under the Paris Agreement. But we're already at 1.2 now. So that's a little bit of a kind of concern. There are lots of things we could focus upon. I'm just picking on one: glaciers. 2 years ago, the Icelandic author André Sneer Magnusson wrote an epitaph to a glacier, the first glacier that had disappeared, called the OK Jökull. Ok Jökull. Jökull is glacier, and it's not OK because it's now disappeared. And right next to this big one on the left side here, Vatnajökull. That's the first significant complete change of a system that we've seen. It's happened in one place. If we go to leap to another part of the world, this will be in your mind. This is actually from northwest Pakistan, northern areas of Pakistan, at the edge of the Himalayas, the Hindu Kush and the Pamirs. There are 47,000 glaciers in the Himalaya, and they provide all the drinking water to 1.6 billion people of the Asian plains. So they feed the Indus, the Mekong, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Yellow River. At 2 degrees increase in temperature, which is quite possible by the middle part of this century, 90% of those glaciers will have disappeared. So we have to find, just in this one area, new sources of drinking water for 1.6 billion people. That's a kind of quarter of the world's population. Impossible. There's no economic model that does that. And we're at that edge point where this suddenly starts to happen. This is Rakaposhi on the left side. That would have disappeared by another 30 years from now. So I'm just kind of trying to introduce an additional level of urgency. If you aren't already concerned about what we should be doing, this is right on the doorstep. The tide is coming at our feet, and the wind is blowing, and the ice is melting, and we need to be acting as fast as we can. It's only 2 months away from the COP26 in Glasgow. I fear many of us don't think a lot is going to happen there, but it would be a great missed opportunity if that were the case. So let me just kind of make a point about inequality here, because that will tie into what we can be doing and should be doing in the future. These are the data from 190 countries across the world of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions by bubble size. The red dots are the countries that produce on average, individual average of more than 10 tons per person. The blue are less than 1 ton per person. In order to get to a safe place for humanity, to get us back to that 350 parts per million I was talking about earlier on, we need to be producing no more than 1 ton each. The world average is about, as you can see from the top of that diagram, nearly 7 tons. That's almost the same for us in the UK, roughly 7 tons. So we have to get from 7 to 1 ton in order to create a safe place for humanity. So governments should be playing a significant role. They need to act to change the structures of economies and institutions, but we as individuals can also play a role to try to get from these higher levels down to 1 ton. I want to make this point, though, that for some countries, they need to increase consumption of things because they haven't got enough. So the rich need to act more than the poor. The poor need to consume more things. The rich need to consume considerably less. And within each of those dots, if we take the UK, it's one of those orange ones that you can see there. As I said, the average per capita, per person, carbon dioxide equivalent production by each of us is about 7 tons, but the richest 1% of us produces more than 50 tons per year. So you can see this kind of stretching of inequality across a range of wealth groups, and that's kind of common in most countries, but it does suggest who should be acting more rapidly. So that kind of sets the urgency of the scene. I think that's kind of where we are historically. That's the big ticket item. It's going to blow the wheels off everything unless we do something really serious about it. Lots of serious things. I'm going to give some specific actions that we can be taking in a bit. I'm going to wrap it round. But let me just say a bit about what Richard was introducing you to, our work that we've done on nature and health. We've done 20 years of research on the health benefits of being in nature, in green places in the broadest sense. And we have been measuring those impacts on health and well-being, physical health and mental health, short-term and long-term. And these are the headlines. Pretty well, everyone seems to benefit. There are almost no counterfactuals. So all social groups, all age groups, right across the board. All environments work, although they do different things. So it works in gardens, urban parks, countryside, high biodiversity reserves, wildlands, if you wanted to call them that way, farmland. So anywhere that's natural, that has nature in it, produces these health benefits. All types of health status, so people who are already healthy benefit, and people who are not healthy also benefit. So you can start to think, oh, that suggests a therapeutic role for activities in nature in order to treat people who aren't in some way well. I'll come back to some evidence on that. And all types of activity, from being pretty active, like running or gardening, to sitting and enjoying the view in a green space. These all have immediate health benefits to us. So it's pretty comprehensive, this. I don't think there's anything that I've seen that would suggest it works in the opposite direction for anybody. So this is quite an interesting kind of, almost a law. It's not really, but it's a kind of outcome of our behaviors. We can say categorically, being in nature produces positive health outcomes. So we know, therefore, that deliberate interventions and what is often called ecotherapies, or as I'll come to this in a little while, green social prescribing, these all work. So once we know that nature produces a health benefit, that means we can actually design things to help people get better in some sort of way. We deliberately used a range of language to help this. We coined the term a dose of nature 11 years ago in a paper that had 2,000 articles written about it across the world. There's the increasing terminology around the health services from nature. So if you're concerned for the green space local to you, you can also marshal an argument to say, well, it's got important biodiversity, it's got important landscape aspects, it's got important heritage, but it's also producing a health service. There's deliberate kind of economic language there, kind of instrumental language, which doesn't tell you actually about what's happening in nature, but it's a useful one to kind of get the ear to say we get health services from being in nature. There's been for some years talk about ecosystem services. The government's 25-year plan for the environment published last year was really excellent, really good. I just hope that people will stick by what's in there. One of the 6 aims or headlines for the 25-year environment plan was about health and health services alongside the other ecosystem services. So therefore, these things produce economic value and therefore contribute to the economy. And we're seeing a kind of another sort of language that started to appear around things called nature-based interventions. Some of you may have seen earlier this year, Partha Dasgupta from Cambridge published his giant report called The Economics of Biodiversity. This was commissioned by the Treasury. It's a 600-page brick of a report. Well, except it would be if you dared to print it out, but it's a big old thing. But it makes some really important comments about language and the importance of green space to us as individuals and to our economies. Interesting, good changes in language. However, so we know these things, but implementation is hard because we're going up against existing policies, processes, institutions, and design principles. We should be thinking about the design of our lived environments, both inside and outside, because they have these important health services to us. But we also need to be thinking about the cultural access to green space. So even if we have green space, people may not feel they can go there. And I've come across lots of examples of this, where people live close to green space, but don't feel as though they're welcomed in some sort of way. So actually you've got it, but people are not getting the benefit from it. So we need to be thinking about how to create cultural access as well as real physical access. So design matters. If I just go inside and just pick kind of one example directly from the health service, it's well established in research that patients in east-facing rooms and in rooms with green views need fewer pain drugs and leave hospital sooner than those without a green view or in non-east-facing rooms. East-facing rooms because you get early morning light, and early morning light's really important for well-being. On average, a day sooner, saves their health service lots of money if they have a green view. But of course, hospitals are not designed to do that. They're designed to be inward looking and to deal with kind of largely medical emergencies. And that's great because they do a really good job with that, but they don't pay attention to the green view. The one part or the two parts of the kind of wider health service that do this really well are hospices. Every hospice I've been in has been designed like this picture at the bottom here, around light, green space, sense of quiet, contemplation, space, opportunities for people to interact and just sit. The same with the wonderful Maggie centres that deal with people with cancer that emerged in Scotland and now are in a whole range of different countries. Similar kinds of design about trying to bring the greenery outside to be inside, or at least accessible, and that has a direct health benefit. So easier to do in certain ways, but wonderful if we could do it more in hospitals, but almost impossible given the strain that they're under at the moment. But the view from the room with the view, to quote E.M. Foster, actually makes a difference. So the impacts of nature, just to kind of summarize how these things tie together, result in improved mental and physical health, especially the first 15 minutes, a big impact from immediately going into nature, and then deeper impacts from longer engagement as other things start to happen. You know, if you spend a day gardening, you're going to notice all sorts of things, or a day on a conservation action group, you're going to notice a lot of stuff and experience changes in weather across a day. If you walk for 20 miles, you're going to see more than if you walk for 20 meters. So other things happen. So I'm not saying you only want 15 minutes, but the more that people get out, they get an immediate benefit. And this is this dose of nature that I've mentioned. There's clear evidence from some really interesting big studies, particularly coming out of China, Korea, Japan, that regular daily engagement with nature improves longevity, increases the amount of time that people live for, and reduces costs on the health service. So increases the health across the whole of the life course. And I just pick one example to show how these things are tied together. Famous study from Caerphilly in South Wales, looking at the impact over 30 years of 5 behaviors: non-smoking, BMI, which is an echo of a kind, obviously, of the kind of food that you're eating, high fruit and veg consumption, regular physical activity in nature, and low to moderate alcohol intake. People with 4 of 5 of those things delayed heart disease by 12 years, lived 6 years longer. People with only 2 of the 5 only lived 2.5 years longer. So the combination of things that we put together in a package for our own way of living makes a direct impact upon our health. Now, that ought not to be a surprise. If we think about it, it should be pretty obvious, but the evidence now backs that up. So we can start to think about the package of what you put together in order to live well for as long as possible. So lots of environments work, from the very local to the edge of the community allotment to the wildlands. We know all of these have an impact upon health. And the sort of thing that is critical, the thing that happens here, is the kind of behavior that we engage in when we're going into nature. So it's not the nature itself is somehow kind of leaking into us. It's because we behave in a certain kind of way. So let me just take you through a couple of examples. Okay, the beach. What happens when you go to the beach? It's a recent cultural invention from 150 years ago, roughly. Before that, nobody did this kind of stuff. Sitting around, doing nothing, chatting to people, wandering around on the muds, gazing at the sky, gazing at their feet, spending all day doing nothing and being really happy about it. You wouldn't do that at home. We don't allow ourselves to do that because we have lists of things to do. But here, when you go to the beach, it's a particular kind of environment that allows people to settle into this kind of quietness, this contemplation, this state of flow that a lot of people now talk about, which that is the thing that brings the benefits. The immersion in the environment brings these health benefits. So that's one example. If I were to ask you, do you have one of these sorts of pictures on your phone or on your camera? Almost everybody, 7.8 billion people in the world, have some kind of image of a sunset. And the reason is we like them. We like the sunset. We think, oh, that's very nice. The one on the right actually is Southend Pier. I think Southend Pier has never looked so gorgeous as this picture that I took from a small plane, farmer's plane, flying over the Thames some years ago. But what's happening when you see a sunset? Is there something innate about those colors, orange, blue, greens, kind of reds and so forth? No, it's not. It's a learned behavior that when we see a sunset, we stop and go, ah, that's nice. And we tell someone about it. It was, come and have a look at that sunset. Oh, it's gorgeous, isn't it? Lovely. So you stop for a moment. You have this moment of kind of meditation or almost prayer-like kind of stopping and calmness, where all the worries of the day disappear, and you look at the sunset and you feel better about it. And then you remember in future that sunsets make you feel like that. But that's as a result of our interaction with them. Now, when you've stood and watched a sunset, afterwards, when you go away, nothing has been used up. It's still all there. The air is the same, the light will have changed, of course, but the water's the same. The environment is still the same. You haven't used it up, but you've got a benefit from it. And that's the critical break here with a lot of other things in the economy. We need to use stuff up in order to kind of get a benefit from it. One other example, sit out and watch the birds. Here, a flock of starlings over an East Anglian marsh. You watch the birds, you listen to the bird song, and afterwards, the birds are still there. You haven't used them up. You haven't suddenly killed 10% of them because you've listened to them, but you've got a benefit from it. And this is the critical bit that links back to the climate crisis bit I've mentioned earlier on, low carbon living and health in nature, is that our activities in nature are going to be almost certainly low carbon of this sort, where you actually don't use up nature as well. So I've been using this term, a good life. You'll recognize this from many of you, I'm sure, from the sitcom of the 1970s, The Good Life. And I've been trying to kind of make a case around ways of living that are good for us. And actually, good life translates into quite a number of different languages. If you look along the bottom here, the Buen Vivir in Bolivia, Ecuador and Colombia has actually been written into their constitutions as an aim for the country. Constitution, not just a policy or political aim. They've been written in to say that's what we should be seeking. And there are lots of other terms about saying something bigger, something kind of quite difficult to define, but suggests kind of a whole range of things that I put here: contentment, well-being, a life with meaning, a sense of purpose, a good life for us as individuals, but also with others, implies obligations for people and nature, and actually turns out to be a key component of happiness. So we've been researching this and the components of this, and how important the thing called the good life is when it comes to thinking about kind of happiness and contentment. So I just wanted to show you a couple of graphs of, again, like the one I showed earlier on, of countries and measures, in this case of population happiness on the left side, the larger graph, 150 countries. The one on the right is 143 countries, but it's life expectancy. And you get this common curve of a sharp cliff and then a flat uplands with kind of increasingly affluent countries. It's GDP per capita along the bottom. So that's the kind of income of countries. At very low incomes, more stuff, more GDP is essential. It increases life expectancy, increases happiness. But then above $10,000 GDP, it gets to be pretty flat. So more income, more stuff doesn't translate into equivalent increases in population and happiness. So that's a snapshot of how it is at the moment. 2018 averages, 2015 to 2019. So the state of play now. If we look back over the past 50 to 60 years, and I've just picked 4 countries here: Japan, UK, China, USA. The red is growth in GDP per person, per capita GDP, and it's a relative scale. So these are ratios, the 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 10 to 40 for the China, shows you how sharply things have increased. In every current affluent country, GDP has increased per person over the past 60 years, and average happiness has not changed. So on average, we have the same levels of happiness as we had in the 1950s and the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and so forth. Of course, for each of us, we go up and down. You know, individually we change during a day, during a month, during a year, and a lifetime. Many of us will have suffered considerably during this recent lockdown period, but spread out and averaged across the whole population, this is the kind of pattern. GDP has not made people happier. And that's a kind of, it's called a paradox. Actually, it's not a paradox, because GDP measures the wrong things. Economies don't deliver happiness. Happiness comes from us doing things that are largely outside the economy, as you'll see in a moment or two. So I've looked at the good life by sampling nearly 200 people in 27 countries, and looking at the things that they said contribute to their good lives. Actually, it's nature, healthy food, togetherness, and personal growth that are the 4 big ticket items. Sustainable consumption, physical activity, and kind of spiritual coherence come at the next level, but it's those 4 big ones: nature, healthy food, togetherness, and personal growth and learning are the really big ones that people talk about. And when you look at other countries, Japan is a good example here. There are these 7 common features appear in countries where people live long and live well. The same factors that I've just mentioned. And as it happened, sustainable consumption fits into this picture as well. As it happens, those things, healthy food, togetherness, connections to nature, physical activity, personal growth, ethical and spiritual coherence, are all low carbon. So if we wanted to be happier and live longer, those are the things we should be doing. And by the way, that's going to help us stop the climate crisis as well. So let me say something about, that's all very well, but what's the choices that lie ahead of us? So let me pick on food, energy, transport, and some other things, leisure and planting trees. Here's an example of some oak trees. So I've got a table here, which is a schedule of the carbon benefits from undertaking particular activities or components of your lifestyle. So let's stay with the orange ones at the top. First of all, if you shift to a vegetarian or a vegan diet, you will save 0.7, 0.8, 0.9 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in a year. And if I could just remind you of your challenge, should you be willing to accept it? You remember the TV program and the films that followed, Mission Impossible. We're hoping this will be Mission Possible. You've got to get from 7 to 1 ton. So you've got to find 6 tons of changes in activity in order to get yourself towards the 1 ton. If you only eat sustainable and organic foods, that's about half a ton. Local food only about 0.4. Reduce food waste 0.3. If you couldn't go vegetarian, you could go 2 meat-free days a week, and that would save about 0.2 of a ton. So you can see a starting point is food. And for me, the shift to low meat vegetarian diets is really one of the things that's at the top of the tree. It's a kind of an activity that a lot of people can do, and actually is now becoming a really serious priority. I declare my hand as a vegetarian. Secondly, we can be thinking about the home and energy. And a big ticket item there is switching electricity supply in your home to renewable sources. Brackets, be really careful of the big companies, because they're not really using renewables. They're using carbon trading and carbon offsets to pretend they're sourcing renewables. So you have to be really sure it's definitely coming directly from a renewable source. But you could save yourself 1.6 tons by doing that. Put in solar panels, depending on how many. I've got some right above me where I'm sitting here, more than 1 ton per year. Refurbishment of the home with greater insulation, 0.8 of a ton. Installing a heat pump, 0.7, and so forth. You can see some things there. Doesn't really make a lot of difference if you go for this kind of lower house temperature bit, where people say, well, you need to suffer a bit in order to kind of save the planet. Actually, taking a couple of degrees off your house temperature and putting on a jumper and getting cold might only save you 0.1 of a ton. So actually much better just to cut out some meat from your diet. And so you can begin to see choices here from this schedule that I'm putting in front of you. And the choices will be different for each of us. Some people will say, I was definitely not doing that, but you know what, I could do that. Transport, big one. Flying, pretty terrible. One return flight from London to Los Angeles, you could do all of those good things, and you could wreck this with more than 3 tons of carbon produced per person by flying from here to LA, or from here to Sydney or Beijing or Hong Kong or something of that kind of nature. More than 3 tons. We've all got to switch to electric vehicles. If you've already done that, you're saving 2 tons roughly a year. But then, as I kind of make the point there, then if you jump on a plane to London, New York, and come back again, that's going to cost 2 tons. So you're just wrecking the thing. So flights, well, we're 10 years away from being able to put renewables in airplanes, but it's a really high priority. If we're going to fly, we need to think about it really carefully. Active transport, of course, is a good thing. So if you only cycle and walk and use public transport, that's about 0.8 of a ton. Hybrid vehicle, less than an electric vehicle. Carpooling, a benefit, and so forth. So you can see the kind of range of things that are available to us there when it comes to transport. And the fourth area is kind of other things. Some smaller items that are working from home now, a really common thing for us. It's definitely making a difference, 0.7 of a ton. But then if you've got a pet, that's going to be about 0.6. So, so no more cats and dogs for those of you who might feel strongly about that. I jest. The point is, again, this is a schedule where we need to make the choices that suit us. And I say to people regularly, do one thing for a year and then choose another thing for the next year and another thing. And then we might get from 7 to 1 ton in a kind of 8 or 9 year period. If you can do that, bingo, we make it. I finished right at the bottom there with my oak trees here. It takes a long time to sequester enough carbon in trees. It takes, if you plant 10 trees, it takes 10 years to save 1 ton. So great thing to do, wonderful. As they say, if you're old, you should plant trees that are going to last 1,000 years and plant them for future generations. Really important, absolutely a priority. But at the moment, it's not making a big difference when it comes to the climate crisis. Great for biodiversity, but it's these other consumption activities around food, energy, transport that are the really big ticket items that are going to add up to that kind of 6 tons that each of us needs to cut in the future. So that's the schedule. So we've got opportunities. Now I want to just tie this finally back into the health bit. So it's all very well, good life, low carbon. Does it make any difference? Well, interestingly, the Chief Medical Officer for a number of years has been talking about a prevent to save agenda. It's actually before COVID. Talk about a new canon of prevention, health being an asset that needs protecting, a concern that the health costs arising from our way of living were and are wrecking the health system, they are. And a call on ways to slow demands on the NHS. This is all language pre-COVID. It's absolutely shown during the pandemic that these are important priorities. It's estimated that there are 15 million people in the UK with long-term health conditions, so-called LTCs, and they comprise 50% of GP appointments, 70% of hospital inpatient days. So it's a real priority to find ways to get people off long-term health conditions and thereby saving money for the health service by staying healthy, of course, making people happier as well. We've done quite a lot of work on this quite recently on what's increasingly now being called social models of health. It's quite interesting. It's kind of trying to reinvent society a bit around kind of health and health services. So the structure of social, economic, and ecological environments matter. They shape current health and future longevity. And we know that green space, and there's a summary of the 4 headlines there, reduces mortality, reduces stress hormones, increases physical activity, and changes dietary decisions and habits, and therefore all add up to greater longevity. These are the things that people in Japan do regularly. That's why they have the highest number of healthy centenarians in the world. So they make a difference in the short term, but in the long term as well. Happiness and life satisfaction matter. So what we've seen is this increasing trend towards what is being called social prescribing from GPs. Very interesting. GP operations realizing that what they should be doing is not just prescribing pills and medical interventions, but environmental interventions, getting people to do stuff in nature. And some of the social prescribing units in some GPs are simply terrific. They are fantastic. They're doing all sorts of things, advice, knowledge, skills development, encouraging people to join social groups, and then also some with therapeutic aims. And this is the nature-based interventions, the NBIs that I talked about earlier on. And they are having a really significant impact. Kind of crept in quietly. We started work some 10 years ago on producing new prescription pads for GPs in this region, in one region of Essex. And simply GPs use those pink prescription pads to write a prescription for people to say, go for a walk every day. And people followed that advice because they went in wanting pills, but the doctor said, go for a walk. And they said, fine. You get higher adherence when they hear it from a doctor than read it in a paper or read it from an environmental activist or researcher or whatever. It's interesting. Doctors have a lot of power, thankfully, in many ways. So they use it, they're prescribing green environments, which is very interesting. We've done research on this, and I want to move quite quickly to some data that we've done on the cost benefits of people engaging in natural places. We've measured the impacts of nature-based interventions recently of 4 programs that are listed there in east of the UK and benchmarked them against the ONS, Office for National Statistics, data on life satisfaction and happiness, LSH there. Essentially what we've got here, the little red dot at the top there is the average happiness of the population in the UK, going back to our data that I mentioned earlier on. The blue are the ranges of happiness amongst different groups. 5% of the population are below 5 in the UK. 30% of the population are between 9 and 10. And the intervention, these green interventions, woodland therapy, ecotherapy, community horticulture, Tai Chi outdoors, all increased in the long term people's happiness and life satisfaction, and by more than a point. Now, this doesn't seem like very much, but actually the research shows on average, all of these projects increased happiness by a point on that 1 to 10 scale. It's super hard to do this. It's really difficult. You get a 1 point boost from really big events like having a child or getting married. You get a 1 point negative by having a death in the family, a close family member. Going up by 1 point is really hard at the population level, and yet we've been able to show that it's common in these nature-based programs. We also measured using the Treasury Green Book, which is the kind of standard game book for measuring the impacts of programs, and we used those standards to look at the costs prevented, both in terms of reduced health and public service use and also reduced loneliness. If you add the two together, it's about £1,500 per person in year 1, and by year 10, it's around about £5,000 to £6,000 net present value. So if people engage in these outdoor activities, the health benefits result in producing these kinds of impacts for public services and for the economy at large. So nature has a direct effect on reducing the pressure on the health services, making us feel better, and contributing to a kind of wider economic benefit. It's very significant, those numbers. They might not look a lot, but if I just took you, if we just leapt up 1 million people, and we think how many people have suffered from COVID during this last 18 months, and then spread that forward 10 years, you're talking about 5 to 6 billion pounds worth of benefits over a 10-year period of 1 million people being outdoors. So I mean, that's very significant, and very interesting that could then play into, for example, planning decisions. If you wanted to protect particular areas, you could be talking about economic benefits created by them. Let me finish with 2 quotes, if I may. One from a long time ago, from the Tao Te Ching, and one from Mary Oliver, who died 18 months ago, February, and just before the lockdown. No, it was the year before, sorry, lose touch of the years. In the Tao Te Ching from 2,500 years ago, chapter 33 said this: the best things in life are not things. And that was my point about the bird song, the garden, the walking in nature, all of those activities that reduced carbon in our profiles, the healthy food, the togetherness activities. Those are the best things in life. And that's what people say when we talk about the good life and the best things in life. They're almost never things. People never say, it's shopping. That's what I really, really want to do. They might still do it, but they know that these other things are the best things in life. And Mary Oliver wrote a wonder poem, American poet she was. She wrote a wonder poem, a 7-word poem. You may know it. She called it Instructions for Living a Life. She said, pay attention, be astonished, and tell about it. So pay attention to nature. Just let it astonish us. Let it leak in and make us go, wow. And then tell other people as well. The more we tell, the more impact we'll have on them as well. And I'll just finish with an image of some kind of recent books. My most recent one was called The East Country, which covers some of this sort of territory about living in close to nature and the impacts it has upon us. Thank you for listening, everybody. That's the headlines from my talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Jules. That's absolutely fantastic. If people like to come back on video now, and if you want to ask a question, please put up a hand and I'll come to you. Jules, can you take the? Oh, that's fine. Lovely.
There we go. I've stopped sharing now. So
that's brilliant.
Yeah.
Now, who would like to ask a question? Please put up a hand if you'd like to ask a question. Gillian, I've seen your hand first.
Thank you. East-facing windows. I know early morning light is important, but when you've got the rest of the day, if you're in a hospital bed, isn't it better to look on, if there is sunshine, brighter aspects? I mean, east-facing can be pretty dull.
Yeah.
For the whole day.
Yeah, yes, I rather suspect that some of those, Gillian, may well have been ones with green views, actually. So I think that they were reported as east facing and then kind of separately reported as green views. I think they probably had green views. And the point around a green view is that it's not like looking at a picture that doesn't change. You see the wind, you see the light changes, you see a bird flying across. You can imagine the sorts of changes. It provokes all sorts of kind of things. As I'm looking out on a green view as I sit here, fortunately, and I think it's that has the bigger effect. But I think there's something around hospitals having an early start to the cycle of the day on wards. You know, 5:30, 6 o'clock. Things are kind of moving into the new rhythms. And I think if you've got natural light helping with that, it does make a difference. But immediately you can think of counterfactuals, like you can say, well, that's not going to work in Scandinavia in the winter, is it? When, you know, it doesn't get light till 11 o'clock in the morning. So, you know, you can, I think I would go with largely the green view, but where there's a lot of light, that itself definitely has an impact upon us.
Yeah, I mean, people suffering from SAD, seasonal affective disorder, if they're using UV lights, they say even the first half an hour of the day should be using those lamps.
Yes,
later. So that might be part of it too.
Yes, exactly. Yes, very good question. Thanks very much. Yeah, super.
Good. Next question. I can't see any hand up at the moment. Is there anybody?
Perhaps they can't.
Wave at me if you have a question. I've got one for you, Jules. Basically, you know, when you said this before, you said how much could be saved by the National Health Service if we only followed some of the areas that you've set out in your talk this evening. Is that economic figure actually getting through to anybody in government, or are you still having trouble in getting them to appreciate it?
I'd love to say it was making a difference, Richard, particularly now as we have seen in the kind of, you know, these lockdown periods, that's slowing the flow of people who are not well and preventing them arriving at hospital is a good thing for them as well as a good thing for the National Health Service. So there's been a kind of change of thinking of that. But what's called the non-communicable diseases, it's a rather slightly unhelpful term, but it means the conditions of ill health that arise from our way of living. And it's largely, as I showed but didn't mention earlier on, obesity, type 2 diabetes, CVDs, cardiovascular diseases. It's about half of dementias. It is mental ill health, and it is loneliness. Those 6 cost the country something like 60 to 70 billion pounds a year, and the revenue of the NHS is around about 120, 125 each year. So there's no wonder the NHS is under stress when the ways of living, those particular ones, are costing more than half of the NHS costs to treat. Now, in theory, in practice, as the evidence shows, if we could stop just some of those, as I showed with that data, we're going to be creating value. In other words, cutting costs, creating benefits. and we could reduce that number, that big ticket number, by an awful lot. I don't think it's getting through hugely yet at the moment because there's been such a kind of focus on this other thing. But it's actually demonstrated a kind of principle of thinking, which I think is probably going to be helpful, because people are going to start saying, well, what can we do to stay healthy and not end up in hospital? And actually, there's lots of things that we can do, as I've been talking about tonight.
Thank you. Carol Fisk.
Yes, good evening. I live in the London Borough of Enfield, and we are in the middle of a huge battle here to try and save a big chunk of our green belt, most of which has either been in the past active agricultural land or active horticultural areas. And I was interested in how highly local food ranked in reducing carbon footprints. I just wondered if you could give any words of advice that we could use. We're all busily writing our objections to the draft local plan at the moment. That goes on till the 13th of September. And we know we're supposed to get something to London Greenbelt Council too. That will be forthcoming, Richard. Any advice on how we can make that argument?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you could make a generic point, which is healthy and sustainable food contributes to cutting the climate crisis. If you can access it locally, even better. Local food, as I showed on that schedule, about kind of 0.3, 0.4 of a ton, depending on kind of how much. If you can cut meat, you're going to get a 0.878 ton benefit. If it can be sustainable stroke organic, you're going to get a half a ton benefit. So if you added some of those things together, that's per person. If you added a number of those together, you can certainly create an argument for saying one of the values of this space that we're trying to protect and look after is that it is providing a low carbon service already. And it would be daft to create a system whereby we replace that with a high carbon service, because we're trying to go in the other direction as much as possible. So I think one could, create a language and environment that says this thing is already doing what we need it to do, producing low carbon food. Why would we want to change? And therefore we need to protect it and look after it more. I think that's the sort of angle that I would probably start with.
That's helpful, because the council seems to think that if they put trees on some other agricultural land, that will offset taking the big chunk of agricultural land they want to cover in concrete, which is obviously absurd.
Yeah, well, as I said, the tree bit is marvelous. Plant more trees, fantastic. It's not going to be quick enough to affect the climate crisis. 10 trees, 10 years, 1 ton. It's not enough. I plant lots of trees. We should all do that, but we're planting them for the next generation. We need to do the consumption activities to make an impact on the climate now. So that's why food kind of comes quite high up rather than on its own, sort of habitat improvement. So protecting what we've got already is super important.
Okay, thank you. Very useful. Thank you.
I think also, Jules, it probably tastes a lot better if it's local and hasn't been frozen.
Sure, absolutely.
Jan Smith, you're next.
Thank you. Fascinating, Jules. Very, very interesting. I've got something here that's, sorry, getting in the way, that's eating up the carbon. Sorry. I recently had an interesting thing happen to me where I had a phone call from the doctor after a blood test saying I was pre-diabetic. I was absolutely shocked because I'm vegetarian. I swim 5 mornings a week. I do all the right things, and I could not believe it. But the outcome of it was that they sent me on a very interesting course, which in fact was extraordinarily educational. And it comes down, a lot of diabetes in this country comes from a very bad diet, which is actually created by the supermarkets. And the way the food is offered to the supermarkets, made of, pretty low quality ingredients and sold, buy 2 get 55, and positioned at the end of a range of display where the kids pick it up because that's what they like. It seems to me that a lot of the problems, particularly of vegetarianism and so on, eating healthily, comes from lack of education. and the fact
Yeah.
that people want cheap food.
Yes.
To me,
Thanks.
is an
Jules, comment on that?
Yes,
absolute
yeah. I mean, just to reecho the point about your lovely cat in the background. The point around the schedule that I made earlier on is that each of us will enter that schedule with different priorities and needs and
Yeah.
opportunities. So it's not to say we shouldn't do any of those things like fly or have pets, or we should do certain things, but we need to do something. So if we pick the one that seems the most obvious for us, we would go for that. You're absolutely right about the food. The invention of so-called ultra-processed foods, the UPFs in the 1980s, was a bit of genius by the food system because they were cheap compounds that are high in calories and do not reduce hunger. And UPFs are a disaster they came along at the time that obesity starts to expand in affluent countries, and they are a wheeze for the food industry because we don't realize what damage they're doing us, which goes back to my previous point to the previous question around kind of local healthy food. You know, if you can do that, pre-diabetics, it's definitely the case that high calorie restriction is the answer. You know, severe cutting of calories can reduce the condition very quickly. There's been some really interesting research recently done on that. So I'd encourage looking at that. Your doctor would be able to advise if I'm not giving medical advice here, but
I think, right, we've got time for one last question. Tim, you were next.
Yeah, of all the fascinating material that you've given us, I thought the most interesting was the relationship, or rather lack of relationship, between growth and happiness. Why then do you think when you get below above about $15,000 or whatever it was per capita, which is well below our average figure in this country, why is it, given that governments around the world persist in pursuing a growth strategy? And in particular, if we wanted to take one example, why do they persist in trying to push for more and more air travel when, as your figures shown, the most that you can possibly do is to cut down on air travel? I'd love your views on that.
Yeah, really good, really big and important question. We fell in a rabbit hole designed by economists in the 1950s and 60s that said that GDP was the kind of the linchpin measure of successive economies. In other words, the consumption of stuff. GDP measures bads as well as goods. If you pollute, that's measured as a contributor to GDP because you have to pay to kind of clean up the pollution. And then we fell in another rabbit hole of so-called neoliberal economics, which is this kind of selfishness model of recent decades that encouraged us to ignore the importance of non-economic social institutions, the importance of togetherness, the importance of volunteering, the importance of working together, or of sitting around a table and sharing food. All of these kinds of things are the things that do contribute to the good life, don't get measured, and yet are actually important to us. So my view is that we're coming to an end of those days. I think that there are lots of signals that suggest that people are recognizing other things are important. I think we particularly saw that in the early days of the lockdown last year, where people celebrated communality and actions for the public good. And I think that kind of upwelling of that showed how important that is to all of us, and plays into the importance of maintaining commons of green space, commons of social institutions that we can access, commons of clean air and biodiversity and clean water, commons of a non-climate threatened world. So I think they all sort of are beginning to change at the moment. I wouldn't say hold your breath for it to go, Tim, but you've ended this on a really important point, because I think we keep needing to argue that the good, if I could just give the headline, the good things in life do not cost the earth. The good things in life are the stuff that make us happy, and they tend to be low carbon, but watch out for the traps, like you mentioned about the international travel. Watch out for the things that blow a hole in your carbon footprint, because if we all fell into that trap all the time, then we'd be back to square one again. And then, as I mentioned earlier on, if the wheels come off in the way they might do with the glaciers across the world, then I really don't know what we do about that. So we've got to stop it in the first place. Enough activists, enough actively interested people, and you can change anything in the world. That's my view.
Well, just thank you very much indeed, Jules. You've given us an awful lot to think about. I'm extremely glad we've got a recording of this, because some of the stuff I will need to go through again, and I'm sure others will too. What a fascinating topic, and what a wonderful way to end it. Tying in climate change with obviously the way we live and what really makes us happy. Thank you so much for this evening. I know by looking at the faces, they've found it fascinating this evening to hear what you've got to say and give us something to hang on to with regards to the countryside and how important it is and how important it's going to become. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Richard, and thank you everybody for joining us on a Friday evening. Thanks a lot.
Not at all, and thank you for everybody attending. Thank you for giving up your time on a Friday evening, much appreciated. And we'll let you know the moment we've got the next talk ready for you. And once again, Jules, thank you so much and enjoy your weekend.
Thank you very much. Marvelous. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.